My name is Kimberly, and I grew up in what seemed like a typical household. My parents were well off, but we weren't living in luxury by any means. It always felt like my older brother was the star of the family. He was 5 years older than me and was always treated like the golden child. My parents sent him to a prestigious private school, while I attended the local public school. It wasn't a bad school, but it was nothing like the elite experience my brother had. I remember one day when I was about 8 years old, I watched a music video of this amazing singer, and I felt this burning desire to learn how to sing. I went to my mom and asked her if I could take singing lessons. She looked at me like I had asked for the most ridiculous thing in the world. "Kimberly," she said dismissively, "singing lessons aren't a real thing. It's just a silly hobby. You should focus on finding a proper career when you grow up." My dad chimed in. "Your brother is the one with the brains in this family. Sweetheart, you're going to have to work with your hands. There's no point in spending money on something as impractical as singing lessons." I was crushed, but not defeated. I started searching the internet for free vocal training tips and practiced in my room whenever I could. It became such a regular thing that, "Kimberly, stop that racket," was a phrase I heard almost every day from my parents. It wasn't until Aunt Sarah, my mom's sister, came into the picture that everything changed. Aunt Sarah was a successful dentist, financially secure, and, unlike my parents, she actually seemed to like spending time with me. One day she caught me singing in my room. I remember feeling so embarrassed, but she just smiled. "Kimberly," she said, "that was lovely. Why didn't you tell me you could sing?" I shrugged, embarrassed as my cheeks flushed red. "Mom and Dad think it's silly." A strange look crossed Aunt Sarah's face, like she was holding back from frowning. "Well, I think it's wonderful. How about we get you some proper lessons?" That moment changed everything. Aunt Sarah became my secret weapon. She bought me a synthesizer, and we spent hours jamming out together. It felt like I had finally found something that was mine, something that made me feel alive. My parents, on the other hand, weren't thrilled when they found out about the lessons. Mom even had the nerve to suggest to Aunt Sarah, "You should be spending that money on our son instead." Aunt Sarah simply smiled and replied, "I think Kimberly has a real talent, and I'm happy to support it." For the first time, someone stood up for me in a way that made me feel seen. I wasn't the family disappointment anymore, at least not to Aunt Sarah. While my brother was living the good life with all his sports and extracurricular activities, I was struggling just to keep my passion alive. One day, he came home bursting with excitement. "Mom, Dad, I want to play hockey," he announced over dinner. I almost choked on my food. It had been tennis last month, football the month before that, and let's not even talk about his brief flirtation with rugby. Did my parents hesitate? Of course not. Dad nodded. "Sure, son, we'll get you signed up tomorrow." Predictably, hockey didn't last long, just like none of the other sports. My brother bounced from one hobby to the next without ever truly committing to anything. But when he declared one day, "I need a gaming computer, top of the line, and I need my own room for training and competitions," my parents, like the pushovers they were, agreed. Mom responded, "Of course, honey. We'll make sure you have everything you need." They even converted the guest room into a gaming haven for him, while I shared a room with my old secondhand synthesizer. It was hard not to feel invisible in that house. My brother's accomplishments, no matter how small, were plastered all over the living room wall. Trophies, certificates, plaques. While I didn't even have a space for my perfect attendance awards or the school singing competition I had won. When it came time for college, things spiraled further out of control. My brother was accepted into an Ivy League university, and my parents couldn't have been prouder. They paid for everything: his tuition, a fancy off-campus apartment, a new car. Meanwhile, I quietly focused on my own future. I had my eye on a small college with a decent vocal program. It wasn't anything prestigious, but it was a start. I knew my parents had saved up a college fund for me, and while it wasn't much, it was enough to cover the basics. Or so I thought. One morning, about a month after my brother and his new wife Melissa moved in with us. Yes, that's a whole other story. My parents called me into the living room. I should have known something was off from the formal tone in Dad's voice. "Kimberly," Dad began, "we need to talk about your future." He went on to explain that they had decided to use my college fund to cover my living expenses for the past 18 years. I blinked, sure I had misheard. What? But what about college? I need that money. My mother's face hardened. Your brother is married now, Kimberly. He needs more space and money for his family. We're giving him your room. The room started spinning. So, what? I'm just supposed to leave? Where am I supposed to go? You're an adult now, Dad said, like he was discussing the weather. It's time you started paying your own way. Get a job. Figure it out. Something inside me snapped. For the first time in my life, I felt real anger toward my parents. You can't do this. I'm your daughter. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home too. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Mom stormed off and returned with a suitcase. Fine, she spat. If you won't leave, I'll pack for you. She started throwing my things into the suitcase while my brother and Melissa watched from the doorway, smug smiles plastered on their faces. Something broke inside me that day. This wasn't my family. I grabbed my clothes, my few personal items, and most importantly, the music books and recordings Aunt Sarah had given me over the years. As I walked out the front door, dragging my suitcase behind me, not one person stopped me. Not one person called me back. I found myself standing on Aunt Sarah's doorstep, my heart heavy and my eyes red from crying. When she opened the door and saw me, she didn't ask any questions. She just pulled me into a hug. Oh, Kimberly, she said softly. Come inside, sweetheart. That night, over a cup of hot cocoa, I told her everything. She listened, her face growing darker with each word. When I finished, she took my hand and said firmly, You're staying here, and tomorrow, we're going to figure out your future. I slept better that night than I had in years, knowing I was finally somewhere I was wanted. The next morning, Aunt Sarah dropped a bombshell on me over breakfast. I'm paying for your college, she announced. I've been saving for years, hoping to help you chase your dreams. That's what this money is for. In the weeks that followed, Aunt Sarah and I pored over college options. She suggested I look into programs that combined acting and singing. You've got a gift, Kimberly, she said. Let's find somewhere that will help you shine. Eventually, we settled on a performing arts college a few hours away. It had an excellent reputation and offered exactly the kind of training I had always dreamed of. When it came time for the entrance exams, Aunt Sarah took time off work and drove me there herself. I sang my heart out, pouring every ounce of emotion into my performance. A week later, I got the acceptance letter. The day I got accepted into college felt like the beginning of a new chapter in my life. Aunt Sarah was over the moon, and I was too. For the first time in a long time, I felt like things were finally falling into place. I threw myself into my studies at the Performing Arts College with everything I had. Every class, every rehearsal, and every late-night practice session became a chance to prove to myself and to my parents that I could make something of my life, even without their support. I signed up for every singing competition I could find and performed in every amateur theater production that would have me. If there was a part in a musical, no matter how small, I was there auditioning. My professors began to notice my dedication, and soon I was landing bigger roles in the college's productions. Before I knew it, 4 years had flown by. I graduated with honors, my final showcase performance earning a standing ovation. That was the moment when everything really took off for me. A talent scout from a major musical theater company had been in the audience that night. After the show, he approached me, talking excitedly about my potential and opportunities he could offer. Next thing I knew, I was signing a contract with one of the biggest names in the business. Suddenly, I wasn't just performing in small college productions anymore. I was on real stages, in front of real audiences, playing lead roles in professional musicals. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. My dream was coming true, faster than I could have imagined. Throughout all of this, Aunt Sarah was my biggest supporter. She came to every performance she could, always sitting in the front row, always the first one on her feet for a standing ovation. After each show, we would go out for late-night pancakes, and she'd gush about every little detail of my performance. It didn't matter how tired I was or how long the show had been. Those post-show talks with Aunt Sarah were my favorite part of the night. Looking across the table at her beaming face, I realized something. This woman, who had no obligation to me other than being my mom's sister, had given me more love and support than my own parents ever had. Aunt Sarah wasn't just my aunt anymore. She was the mother I had always wished for. Life was finally going great. I had just landed a lead role in a new musical that was generating serious buzz, and everything felt like it was falling into place. One afternoon, I stopped by Aunt Sarah's house, bursting with excitement about my plans and upcoming projects. "Aunt Sarah, you won't believe what's happening," I gushed, telling her all about the musical and my future opportunities. She smiled warmly, listening as she always did, encouraging me with every word, but as I was getting ready to leave, she suddenly grew serious. "Kimberly," she said softly, "you've grown into such a wonderful young woman. Don't you think it's time to reconcile with your parents? They're still your family, dear." I was taken aback. After everything my parents had done, kicking me out, ignoring my dreams, how could she expect me to forgive them? I wanted to argue, to remind her of all the hurt they had caused, but the hopeful look in her eyes stopped me. Aunt Sarah had done so much for me. How could I refuse her this one request? "Okay," I said reluctantly. "I'll try." The next day, I found myself standing on my parents' doorstep, feeling like a stranger. When my mom opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. "Kimberly," she said slowly, like she couldn't believe it was really me. "Hi, Mom," I forced a smile. "Can I come in?" They let me in, but the tension was palpable. The house felt different, colder somehow. I quickly noticed that my brother was still living there. Apparently, things hadn't worked out with his wife, Melissa. She had left him, and my parents were letting him stay with them. Mom grumbled something about how Melissa played video games all day and never lifted a finger to help out around the house. I tried to make small talk, but it was clear I wasn't really welcome. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was always with a sense of detachment, like I was an outsider in my own family. After a few days of this cold indifference, I was about ready to give up on the idea of reconciliation. That's when my brother cornered me in the kitchen. "So," he sneered, still chasing that silly singing dream. "Let me guess, you're a star in some dingy bar now?" Something inside me snapped. I stood up straight, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Actually, I'm the lead singer in several successful musicals, and I'm doing quite well for myself. Thank you very much." You should have seen their faces. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, my parents couldn't stop asking questions. "Musicals? Really?" Dad asked, his curiosity piqued. "How much do you make?" I tried to leave, but Mom practically blocked the door. "You must be making good money now," she insisted. "How much is your contract worth?" I didn't owe them any answers, but they kept pressing me. It was clear they didn't care about my success. They cared about the money. "That's confidential," I said firmly, trying to edge past them. Dad's face hardened. "Now, listen here, young lady," he growled. "After everything we've done for you, you owe us. We're your parents. You're obligated to help us and your brother." That was it. I was done being polite. "I don't owe you anything," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You kicked me out, remember? You told me I wasn't worth investing in. Well, guess what? I made it without you, and I don't need you now." I walked out the door without looking back, heading straight to Aunt Sarah's house. When she opened the door and saw my face, she didn't need to ask what had happened. She just opened her arms and pulled me into a hug. In that moment, I knew where I truly belonged. Aunt Sarah was my real family. This was home. Life has a cruel way of pulling the rug out from under you just when things seem to be going well. I was riding high on my success, performing in sold-out shows night after night, when I got the call that would change everything. Aunt Sarah had cancer. The world stopped spinning. I wanted to drop everything and rush to her side, but she wouldn't hear of it. "Your dreams are my dreams too," she told me over the phone, her voice weaker than I had ever heard it. "Don't you dare give them up for me." So I kept touring, but every free moment I had, I spent with Aunt Sarah. We'd sit in her garden, talking about everything and nothing. I tried to memorize every detail of her face, the sound of her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. but cancer is a cruel and relentless enemy. Despite the treatments, despite our hopes, Aunt Sarah's condition worsened rapidly. Then one day, while I was in the middle of a tour, I got the call I had been dreading. Aunt Sarah was gone. I was lucky, if you can call it luck, that I had a few days break between shows. I caught the first flight home, my heart heavy with grief. Aunt Sarah's funeral was a simple but beautiful affair, exactly the way she would have wanted it. But once the service was over, I had to fly back out on tour. The show must go on, they say, but every performance felt hollow. I was there, hitting the notes, but my heart wasn't in it. How could it be when it was broken into a million pieces? When the tour finally ended, I returned home, exhausted and grieving. That's when I got a call from a notary. Apparently, Aunt Sarah had left a will, and I needed to come in to discuss it. I didn't really care what she had left me. Nothing could replace her. But I went to the meeting anyway. When the notary started reading the will, I was in shock. Aunt Sarah had left me everything. Her house, her savings, all of it. I broke down right there in the office. She had given me her final gift. Even after she was gone, moving into Aunt Sarah's house felt bittersweet. It was filled with memories of her, and though it was comforting in some ways, it also reminded me of the enormous void her absence left in my life. Just as I was beginning to settle in and figure out what my next steps would be, the past came knocking, literally. One afternoon, there was a loud banging on the door. When I opened it, I found my brother standing there looking disheveled and desperate. "I need money," he blurted out before I could even say hello. "Melissa left me, and I've been kicked out of Mom and Dad's house. You've got to help me, Kimmy." I stared at him, dumbfounded. After everything that had happened, this was how he approached me? "Why don't you get a job?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could. He looked at me like I had just suggested the most outrageous thing. "A job? I don't need a job. I need money. You've got plenty now, don't you? Aunt Sarah left you everything." Hearing him refer to Aunt Sarah as that old lady made my blood boil. "That old lady," I spat, "was more family to me than you ever were. And no, I'm not giving you money." His face twisted in anger. "You tricked her, didn't you? You manipulated that senile old woman into giving you everything. You're nothing but a thief." I felt something snap inside me. "Get out!" I snarled. "Get out of my house right now!" He opened his mouth to say something else, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. "Go ahead, take me to court. See if a judge believes your nonsense about how you abandoned your sister but now want handouts. Go on, get out." He left, but not without throwing one last glare over his shoulder. As I stood there, leaning against the door, I realized that this house, this inheritance, wasn't just Aunt Sarah's final gift to me. It was her way of protecting me, even after she was gone. Just when I thought the drama with my brother was finally over, I got a call. This time, it was from my parents. I almost didn't answer, but something inside me told me to pick up. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe a part of me was still clinging to the idea of having some kind of resolution with them. "Kimberly." My mother's voice came through the phone, overly sweet, which immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. "We heard about the inheritance. Don't you think you should share some of that with your family?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they'd put me through, now they were asking for a share of what Aunt Sarah had left me? "Are you serious right now?" I asked, my voice turning cold. "After all this time, you suddenly care about being family?" Mom's tone changed immediately, becoming more insistent. "We're your parents, Kimberly. You've got so much now, surely you can spare some for us. You have an obligation to help us." That was it, the final straw. "Family?" I snapped. "You want to talk about family? Where was your sense of family when you kicked me out? When you told me I wasn't worth supporting? When you chose my brother over me, over and over again? Aunt Sarah left me everything because she believed in me. She supported me when you abandoned me. You don't get to be family now that it's convenient for you." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by my father's voice, colder than I'd ever heard it. "You ungrateful little wretch. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" I hung up before he could say another word. My hands were shaking, but I felt a strange sense of relief. I had finally said everything I'd been holding in for years, and I didn't regret a single word. But that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I started seeing posts on social media. My parents had gone on a full-blown smear campaign, posting long, emotional rants about how their daughter had manipulated her dying aunt into leaving her everything. They painted me as some kind of greedy, heartless villain who had stolen from the family. According to them, I hadn't even bothered to give Aunt Sarah a proper funeral. Of course, it was all lies. Aunt Sarah's funeral had been exactly what she wanted: simple, peaceful, and full of love. But my parents didn't care about the truth. They were out for revenge, and social media was their weapon of choice. Soon, old acquaintances and distant relatives were flooding my inbox with hateful messages, calling me names and accusing me of being a thief. Every time I opened my phone, there was a new barrage of insults waiting for me. It felt like the entire world had turned against me, and it was suffocating. But it didn't stop there. My parents created fake accounts to harass me when I blocked their real ones. My brother joined in, spreading even more lies about how I had somehow tricked Aunt Sarah into leaving me everything. And then came the final blow. I heard through the grapevine that they were planning to sue me. My parents, my brother, they were all looking for lawyers to contest the will. For a moment, I felt real panic. What if they won? What if they somehow managed to take away Aunt Sarah's final gift to me? It felt like everything was crumbling around me. I hired a lawyer of my own just in case, terrified of what could happen, but when I explained the situation to him, he gave me a reassuring smile. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said confidently. "The will is ironclad. Your aunt was of sound mind when she made it, and her wishes are clear. They can try to sue, but they'll lose. And they'll lose badly." Hearing that was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. The law was on my side. Aunt Sarah's wishes would be respected, no matter what my family tried to do. I wasn't going to lose everything. The harassment didn't stop overnight, but knowing I had the legal upper hand gave me the strength to push through. I started blocking accounts, reporting the worst offenders for harassment, and slowly but surely, the tide of public opinion began to turn. People started seeing through my parents' lies, and eventually the hateful messages became fewer and farther between. It didn't make the pain go away completely, but it gave me room to breathe again. 2 years flew by in a whirlwind of success. My career had taken off in ways I never imagined. I was performing in sold-out shows night after night, touring internationally, and even making television appearances. My face was on billboards, my name in bright lights. Every performance felt like a tribute to Aunt Sarah, a way to honor her belief in me. But just when I thought I'd finally left the past behind me, something happened that threw me right back into the chaos I thought I'd escaped. It was during one of my home state performances, a huge, sold-out show that I'd been looking forward to for months. The energy in the theater was electric, and as I stood center stage, singing a heart-wrenching ballad, I felt on top of the world. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed 2 figures standing up in the middle of the audience, holding up a large, hastily made poster. Even from the stage, I could make out the words, "Kimberly stole our money." My heart dropped. I didn't need to squint to know who they were, my parents. Before I could even react, my father's voice boomed through the theater. "She's a thief!" he yelled. "She manipulated her aunt and stole our inheritance." The audience, which had been so enchanted by the performance just moments earlier, was now whispering and murmuring in confusion. My co-stars froze on stage, unsure of what to do. For a second, I felt like the scared, insecure girl I had been when they kicked me out of their house. The spotlight felt like it was suffocating me, but only for a second. Something inside me clicked. This was my stage, my life, and I wasn't going to let them ruin it. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the commotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my tone calm but firm. "I'm sorry for the interruption. Unfortunately, those individuals are my estranged parents, who have been harassing me for years. But I assure you, nothing they say is true." The crowd hushed, the murmuring stopped, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then, slowly, applause started to build. It grew and grew until it drowned out my parents' shouts, which were now being silenced by security as they were escorted out of the theater. I finished the show stronger than ever, fueled by a new sense of empowerment. That night, I knew I had given one of my best performances, not because of the applause, but because I had stood up for myself. No longer was I the girl who let her family's cruelty define her. I was in control of my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. The next morning, I called my lawyer. It was time to put an end to this, once and for all. We compiled years' worth of evidence, witness testimonies, threatening texts, social media posts, and the incident at the theater. Armed with all of that, we went to court. The case was clear. The judge issued a restraining order against my parents, legally prohibiting them from contacting me or being anywhere near my performances. It was over. In the years that followed, my career reached new heights I had never dreamed of. I performed on stages all over the world, met incredible people, and continued to grow as an artist. My brother and parents became distant memories, people I could pass by without a second thought. They were no longer a part of my story. Instead, I built a new family. A family of friends, fellow performers, and fans who had followed my journey from the start. I carried Aunt Sarah's memory with me every step of the way, knowing that without her love and belief in me, I never would have made it this far. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was more than enough. As the years passed, my life continued to blossom in ways I could have never imagined. My career had become everything I dreamed of and more. I was performing all over the world, singing on stages I had once only fantasized about. Every night, I felt the energy of the audience, the applause, the connection with the people who had come to see me live out my passion. Aunt Sarah's memory was with me at every performance. She had been the one to see the light in me when no one else did. Every time I stepped onto the stage, I knew I was fulfilling her dream as much as my own. I missed her deeply, but I also felt her presence in every song, in every success. She was the wind beneath my wings, and I owed everything to her. My life was good, really good. I had become well known in the musical theater world, with my name appearing in marquee lights and my voice gracing theaters from New York to London. But the higher I climbed, the more I realized how much I had outgrown my past. My brother and parents, who had once dominated so much of my emotional landscape, were fading further into the background. With the restraining order in place and years of silence from them, I was finally free from the constant drama they had caused in my life. I was able to focus on the present, on my career, and on the people who mattered to me. My newfound freedom allowed me to create a new family, a chosen family. My fellow performers became my siblings. My friends became my support system, and my fans became my extended family, cheering me on every step of the way. I surrounded myself with people who genuinely cared about me, people who celebrated my successes without expecting anything in return. It was a stark contrast to the toxic relationships I had left behind. I had finally found peace. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It was during a particularly busy season of performances that I received another unexpected visitor. This time, not at my doorstep, but backstage after one of my shows. I had just finished a spectacular performance in front of a packed theater when one of the stagehands knocked on my dressing room door. "Kimberly, there's someone here to see you," he said, looking uncertain. "He says he's your father." My heart sank. I hadn't heard from my parents in years, not since the restraining order had been put in place. What could he possibly want now? The thought of facing him again made my stomach twist. But curiosity, or maybe the need for closure, pushed me to agree to meet him. I told the stagehand to send him in, and moments later, my father walked through the door. He looked older, more frail than I remembered. His usual stern demeanor was softened by something I hadn't seen in him before. Guilt, perhaps? Regret? "Kimberly," he said, his voice quieter than I expected. "Can we talk?" I stood there, arms crossed, not saying anything. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave, to never come back. But another part of me, the part that still wanted answers, still wanted to know why my own family had treated me the way they did, decided to hear him out. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable in the silence. I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted to apologize. I blinked, stunned. An apology? After all these years? He continued. Your mother and I, we were wrong. About so much. We didn't realize what we were doing to you, not until it was too late. His voice wavered. We were so wrapped up in your brother, in trying to make sure he had everything he needed, that we neglected you. And when you became successful, we let our jealousy and pride get in the way. I didn't know what to say. Hearing my father admit this, something I had known all along but never expected to hear from his lips, left me speechless. But I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. Why now? I finally asked, my voice steady but guarded. Why are you here now after all these years? He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping. Your mother, she's sick. Really sick. Cancer. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. My mother, the woman who had kicked me out, the woman who had chosen my brother over me time and time again, was dying, and now my father had come not just with an apology but with a plea for help. She wanted to see you, he continued. She wanted to make things right before it's too late. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. Part of me wanted to walk away, to tell him that they had made their bed and now they had to lie in it. But another part of me, the part that remembered how Aunt Sarah had always encouraged me to forgive, to be better than the bitterness that had once consumed me, couldn't ignore what he was saying. I'll think about it, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. But don't expect anything. My father nodded, looking relieved just to have gotten that far. Thank you, Kimberly. I'll tell her. With that, he left, and I was alone again in my dressing room, my head spinning with 1,000 thoughts. After all these years, my parents were reaching out to me, asking for forgiveness. But could I really give it to them? Could I let go of all the pain, the betrayal, the years of neglect? I wasn't sure. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Part of me wanted to just forget about the whole thing, to move on with my life and focus on the career I had worked so hard to build. But another part of me, the part that still yearned for some kind of closure, kept pulling me back to the idea of seeing my mother, of facing her one last time before it was too late. Finally, After much deliberation, I made my decision. I called my father and told him I would visit. The visit was difficult, to say the least. My mother looked frail, a shadow of the woman I had known, lying in a hospital bed hooked up to tubes and machines. Her face lit up when she saw me, though it was clear that she was weak. Kimberly, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. For everything. I stood at the foot of her bed, not knowing what to say. There was so much history between us, so much hurt, that I couldn't just forgive her with a single word. But as I looked at her, I realized something important. Holding on to the anger, the resentment, wouldn't bring me peace. It would only continue to weigh me down, just as it had for years. So I did the only thing I could do in that moment. I let go. I forgive you, I said softly, the words feeling both heavy and light as they left my lips. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long time, I saw her as something more than just the woman who had hurt me. I saw her as a flawed, imperfect human being, just like me. She passed away a few weeks later. In the end, I realized that forgiveness wasn't for her. It was for me. It was a way to release the hold my past had on me, to finally move forward with my life without the weight of bitterness dragging me down. My parents had made their choices, and I had made mine. But I didn't need to carry their mistakes with me anymore. As I stood at her grave, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't closure in the way I had expected, but it was enough. I could move forward now, free from the shadows of my past, and so I did. My career continued to soar, and with every success, I carried Aunt Sarah's memory with me. She had been the one to see my potential, the one to love me unconditionally when no one else did. I owed her everything, and I would honor her by living the life she had always believed I could have. I wasn't just Kimberly, the forgotten daughter anymore. I was Kimberly, the star, the woman who had overcome everything to create the life she deserved.